Hello and welcome to the Roundtable Podcast. My name is Shogun. Joining me today is my good friend Engineer. We are going to discuss UFOs, aliens, and disclosure. There's some very big news in this area today and recently. We're going to get his opinion on that, and then we're going to open it up for audience discussion. Before we do, make sure you follow us and subscribe on YouTube and BitChute and Podbean. You can download Podbean on your phone and download the Roundtable Podcast. We have over 200 episodes on your phone. Listen on the go. But most of all, join the Roundtable Discord server where we record the podcast every day at 8 p.m. Central. So that being said, welcome, Engineer. Thank you for joining me again. How are you, sir?
Hello, I'm doing quite well yourself. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, I'm doing great, thanks. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So to get the ball rolling, I'm not sure if you saw the news or not, but there was a statement, a disclosure of sorts, from the Israeli former head of space security. So fairly significant whistleblower, so to speak, high-level clearance, pretty advanced nation, Israel, and working specifically in the domain of space and space security. So if anybody would know about such things, it would be someone like this. And what he has claimed publicly, and this is not just like conspiracy above top secret type shit, this is NBC, BBC, Fox News, like mainstream, right? And he's saying there is a galactic federation of aliens. They're in contact with humans. We know about them. We're working with them. Humans are working with the Galactic Federation aliens on Mars in underground bases. But the aliens feel that humans are not yet ready to know about them. But for some reason, he has chosen to defy them by disclosing it anyway, I guess. So my first question to get the ball rolling is, have you heard this story? And if so, what is your take on it?
I have heard of this. However, I don't, anytime we're talking about institutions of hierarchical power that involve nation states with poor track records, which is a lot of nation states, not to single out Israel. We have to understand that there are a lot of political interests at play here. So anything that he says could be, a lie or a partial lie to push a political narrative or agenda. So the concept of a federation or various other aspects, right? This, there could be a lot of hidden motivations behind what he's saying. So every single word has to be analyzed, and the rhetorical weight of those words and the implications thereof. It's hard to prognosticate ultimately, but I don't know. I don't trust everything that he said.
Well, and I think that's totally valid because there's two ways to read this. One, he's a whistleblower and he's disclosing. And two, it's some kind of psyop or false information, because there could be advantages to either. And really, when you think about it, it's more coherent that it would be a psyop, because if indeed there was actual aliens, this would be above top secret. If they really said, don't tell anybody, they're not ready. Well, then, if the advanced aliens say, don't tell anybody, they're not ready, it'd be kind of malevolent to go against them, because presumably they know what they're talking about and you're going to cause panic. And on the flip side, if there is a government conspiracy, that you're probably going to get a bullet in the brain, right? But on the flip side, if you say, oh, yeah, there's aliens and they're working with America and Israel, which is what he claimed, then it makes it sound like, the forces of the cosmos are aligned with Israel and America, which would serve their political interests. So
right. The fact that he uses the word federation to describe an alien life form or civilization indicates to me that this is more posturing than it is validity, because the mind of a completely alien, species or organism or life form, it's very mathematically improbable that they would form what we would call a government or a federation, especially at the degrees of technological prowess, where one achieves the ability to travel through interstellar space at superluminal velocities. Once you're able to cross vast distances and have such a degree of resource abundancy, things like governments, corporations, and economies in and of themselves become obsolete.
Yes, I think that's coherent. But the one thing that gives me pause is what this guy is saying is actually very similar to, I know you and I have discussed this before, but Canadian Minister of Defense, former, but again, very significant individual, controlled all of Canada's military and aircraft and Air Force. he said very similar things, right? He said there's this advanced, interstellar nation of some kind or group. They're in contact with us. They're helping us with technology. We have a secret space program that's way more advanced than we're letting on. So Paul Hillier said all the same things, essentially. And that does give me a bit of pause. Like, was he doing the same thing? Or is this actually true? So what is your take on the Paul Hillier disclosure?
I think Paul Hillier is a lot more of an honest, upfront person. If I'm recalling correctly, he describes these entities more of as a species rather than, an organization, right? So he describes various extraterrestrial species, but he doesn't describe necessarily banners or federations or, organizations or corporations, right? Here's the thing, right? If an interstellar species can have a government, then it also follows that they would also likely have corporate organizations to economically support that government. There's a fairly high chance, right? Now, obviously, a species like the Borg doesn't have a government because they have a unified singular consciousness. So why doesn't anyone that talks about a quote unquote galactic federation? How come nobody talks about interstellar corporations? Well, probably because both of them don't exist, and it's probably because it's not practical for them to exist.
That makes sense, but I think we can only speculate about what, social organization, corporations, religion, motivations, right? We really don't know, right? Maybe they have a big church like the Covenant from Halo, right? They were all run by a church type structure. Maybe, like you said, the Borg, they have one mind, or maybe they have a federation. We don't know. So we can speculate. But another possibility is they don't really have a federation, but they're much more advanced than us. And so they studied us before they came here. And like, okay, these humans operate according to government. So they'll understand government, right? We're going to go talk to the U.S. government. So we'll pretend we're a government too. And we'll just call ourselves a federation because they're a federation. And then we'll seem like we're on the same page. So it could almost be just the aliens patronizing us and giving us whatever concept they think we can actually understand, when in reality it's totally different,
That could totally be the case. It could also be that, these various people that are in high positions of power use the phrases that the general public would understand, because if these people in high positions of power be like, oh yeah, we've been talking to extraterrestrial life, and everybody starts asking like, oh, what is their civilization like? What's their culture like? And the politicians and the power brokers and the generals and etc. they scratch their head and go, well, they're kind of just dudes that exist in space. Like they're, the general public would not accept that answer.
All right. So one more question along these lines I want to ask you. There's also been a whole series, I'm sure you've seen, really over the last 12 months or more. There was the CIA disclosed a bunch of photos of UFOs that they said were authentic. Then the Navy disclosed multiple videos of UFOs that they said were not human and were authentic. The UK declassified thousands of UFO files. Canada declassified thousands of UFO files. Japan declared an official UFO policy. The U.S. Air Force declared a new program to study UFOs and continue existing studies of UFOs. The Tic Tac photos came out from like fighter jet footage of these highly maneuverable craft. So, when you put all of this together, there's really only two possibilities. One, aliens exist and they're disclosing. Two, this is Project Blue Book. This is a big psyop and they're trying to fake or convince us of this. But those are really the only two options, or am I missing something?
There's also Luis Elizondo, if you know who that guy is. He worked for the Department of Defense and is working with Tom DeLonge's To the Stars, which has an entire outfit of CIA officials that have, like they have Hal Puthoff, who was in charge of the remote viewing project and a prominent Scientologist in the 70s, that later got into Project Stargate and this psychic phenomena and remote viewing concept. But Luis Elizondo has lots of stuff online you can go find. He talks about them as saying they're not a threat unless they want to be. I mean, they are super advanced, so clearly they could be if they want to. And you kind of know my interpretation of it. I think they're playing around with us, and the American governments and every other government can't really do anything about it. So they're trying to get the word out in some shape or form, so that people that interact with them when they force, because they're basically have been going around abducting people, and there's MUFON reports of 20 million abduction reports worldwide. I mean, they're not all suffering a collective psychosis, but the human race has created a mental issue around the scenario because of the cover up. So we have an entire field of mental health that is being not only manipulated by the concept of these beings existing, and now we're starting, like the Israeli guy said, like 5 years ago they would have locked them up, put them in a mental hospital. Air Force pilots used to be fired, or if they talked about it, because that's clearly a mental issue. So they're coming around in some shape or form, but I call it a controlled soft disclosure, where they just kind of put enough out there to say what's really going on, when the reality of it is much different, and the reality is they have been in communication and doing all kinds of shit.
I would rather keep this discussion to that which we know and is provable, that which is falsifiable, and then establish that which we know to be true, and then build upon there various possibilities, right? So, I don't want to go down the route of how you say, I don't want to posit speculative presumptions and hypotheses as matter of fact when they're not.
So hold on one second, please. So this is actually an interview podcast right now, but I do appreciate what you just added, NSA, and we will be opening up for everybody soon. But I am going to continue the interview with Dr. Weird a little bit more first. But I, generally speaking, widely agree with what NSA just said there. But like Dr. Weird said, that's kind of jumping to the conclusion, putting the cart before the horse. So we were discussing, the disclosure of evidence by basically every major nation, which is certainly a change. And you could even mention things like the discovery of like biosignatures on Venus, which is considered the strongest ever evidence of extraterrestrial life. Basically a biogenic gas that has only ever been known to be produced by either technological or biological means, either of which would indicate life. So that's quite interesting. And so I guess what I want to ask you is these things like the Tic Tac UFOs, right? The reason they call them UAPs, we say UFO for unidentified flying object, but the military and government says UAP for unidentified aerial phenomenon, or in some cases unidentified aerial threat. So these are thought to be not human because they display flight characteristics that are impossible for any known technology, right? And the U.S. has by far the most sophisticated aircraft with the B-2 and B-21 Spirit bombers and the new version of that, and then the F-35 and F-22. There's nothing better than those things in the sky by light years, right? And yet these things can do things that those vehicles cannot even remotely possibly do. So this is one reason I wanted to talk about to you, because I've heard you talk quite a bit about these, like what this extraterrestrial tech kind of is or can do. So what do you think about that, basically? Is this footage legitimate? And if so, what can you tell us?
We know that the footage is legitimate, despite, there's a YouTuber that goes by the name Thunderfoot. He's an engineer and a physicist, but he tried to debunk the UFO video released by the U.S. Navy. And he's like, oh no, it's totally just a bird, right? But the problem is that we know that it's not a bird, because the U.S. Navy has told us that it's not a bird. Now, that doesn't mean that they're lying. Thunderfoot and the general public only has access to the video. The U.S. Navy has access to multiple radar logs from both the interceptors, the fighter jets that were scrambled to intercept this aircraft. They have radar logs from aircraft such as Boeing E-3 Sentries and other high altitude radar aircraft, right? So carrier battle groups move as a fleet, right? It's not just the aircraft carrier gets sent. You have aircraft carriers which are escorted by destroyers and destroyer escorts, which are accompanied by submarines, typically fast attack submarines. And then there is then there are what's called high altitude radar systems. And the Navy particularly uses the Northrop Grumman E-2 Hawkeye, and they use this to provide a high altitude mounted radar which can project and see downward so that things like chronoplanes can't approach the carrier battle group unseen. And even though the radar systems that were in the fighter interceptors that were scrambled, those were actually jammed at the local level. They did get the thermal imaging. That's what the video is this thermal imaging video cameras. However, the local, the fighter jet radar systems were partially jammed. However, we did get multiple radar logs. The U.S. Navy did confirm that they have multiple radar logs from the two Hawkeye, from their destroyers, and from the radars mounted on the carrier itself. So we have a multiplicity of radar systems that are tracking and logging this aircraft as it's performing maneuvers, is tracking the maneuvers, knowing exactly what it does. So the probability that all of these different radar systems would fail and glitch in the same way at the same time to give the exact same results is basically null, considering that this is the U.S. Navy. They have some of the most advanced radar and flight systems available to them. They have thousands of warrant officers and commissioned officers and scientists on their payroll to look at these logs. And these radar logs have been corroborated by the eyewitnesses of the pilots, specifically the fighter pilots that were up close and personal with this craft. And these fighter pilots have better than average human vision by a long shot. They undergo years of rigorous training. They go mental background checks for mental health and psychology. These are professional people that are paid a big, quite a pretty penny for what they do because they're really good at what they do, some of the best in the world. And so when I have a multiplicity of fighter pilots, we have the radar logs from the E-2 Hawkeye, from the carriers, from the destroyers, partial data from the fighter jets itself. We cannot deny the validity that this is a physical object, not a bird. The Navy knows how big it is from the radar logs. The problem is that the Navy can't release any of the radar logs at all, and there's a reason why. If they did release the radar logs for any event whatsoever, it doesn't have to be a UFO-related event. If ever they release radar logs of maneuvering of like this, any near-peer powers such as Russia, China, etc., can back engineer, at least to an extent, the capabilities and roughly how these radar systems work. So the U.S. Navy has not and will not release the radar logs. However, they have the radar logs, and they have thousands of scientists working for them and engineers. They know what they're doing. They know what they're looking at. And when they tell us that this is not a bird, this is not a plane, and is performing maneuvers that are impossible with our current degrees of technological prowess, this is a true UFO. Doesn't matter what Thunderfoot says. Doesn't matter what anybody says. Doesn't matter if somebody calls you a conspiracy theorist. The United States Navy and the Pentagon has confirmed that this is a UFO.
So thank you very much for steelmanning that to such an incredible extent, because there are some people who buy the bird explanation. I did not buy that for a second, and I'm glad. I know you don't either, obviously. But this is swamp gas, right? Remember, Project Blue Book was a government-funded UFO cover-up, and their narrative was UFOs being seen by thousands of people all across the country, flying across the sky in flying saucers, is swamp gas. And it's just gibberish. It doesn't even cognitively make any kind of sense. But all that they have to do is just give an explanation for people who don't want to believe, and to just, because I've had people say, that was just a bird? And my reaction was the same as yours. Like, you think these people fought the Soviet Union and the Cold War and the Nazis, but can't tell the difference between a bird and a fighter plane or a UFO? It's a laughable nonsense conclusion. I completely agree with you.
And if the Navy ever did release the radar logs, they won't for the reasons that I gave, right? But, when we have multiple eyewitnesses and multiple of the best radar systems in the world, and these aren't just normal people eyewitnesses, these are some of the best trained pilots in the world that are trained. These are not just like civilian pilots. These are military pilots that are trained on identifying an aircraft on the fly very quickly. It is their full-time job to constantly train, be in the best shape of their lives, both physically and mentally. I'm sorry. All of this data, not only combined, but the fact that all the scientists and engineers and warrant officers and commissioned officers that looked at the data, that did after-action reports, that interviewed the pilots, they have all concluded, thousands of the best of highly trained people have concluded that this is not a bird. The radar systems are accurate. There was no glitch, no errors, no dysfunctionality to be had in any of the radar systems, be it on any of the multiple destroyers, not on the carrier, and not on any of the aircraft, except for the jammed fighter jets that had their local radars temporarily jammed. Who temporarily? Did a bird jam the radar systems?
Mm-hmm. So I think that is fully established, and I totally agree with you. But I did also want you to elaborate a little bit on what you believe the capacities of these kinds of extraterrestrial, presumably, vehicles are. Because I've heard you talk at some length, I believe, about some recovered crash that was analyzed and the components, how they stack the atoms to make the hull and what kind of speeds it can do and so forth. So whatever intelligence you might have on this, however, whatever its source may be, can you share it with the audience?
Yeah, I'd like to point to Dr. Leviat's book, Secrets of Anti-Gravity Revealed. Dr. Paul A. Leviat, I believe that is his name, if I recall correctly, that's the author. He wrote an entire book about many esoteric flight systems, navigation systems, thrust systems, etc. He was first to talk about the ionic propulsion systems that the B-2 are assisted by, which has only recently come out and confirmed to be true. So this gives high credence to Paul A. Leviat's works on the subject. We can look at people like Colonel Philip J. Corso, who is the base commander of, one of the bases in New Mexico during the Roswell incident. He read some of the after-action reports of the cleanup site. Now, if you look at Lieutenant Chester Barton was a lieutenant at the time, and he was involved in the cleanup. Chester Barton was of the opinion that what had happened was an experimental American bomber was carrying a nuclear payload, a nuclear weapon, and it crashed in the New Mexican desert because everybody was wearing hazmat suits. Fair enough. Could totally been a bomber that crashed with the nuclear bomb on it. Could totally been that. However, Colonel Philip J. Corso, who was the base commander at the time, a full-bird colonel, who read the after-action reports, he says otherwise. There's lots of other, evidence regarding Roswell. It's, it's a well-documented event. There's a lot of conflicting reports, but the documents are pretty sound if you actually want to peruse through them. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that if these various credible people, if these various credible eyewitnesses are to be taken at their word, I have to emphasize here that many of these people don't know each other. They did not know each other. They had no time to conspire about these things. And one of the best ways to determine whether or not a group of people is lying is to interview them separately. And if their story isn't consistent, you know that they're lying. And people try to, oftentimes, criminal organizations and so on and so forth, will try to create a false narrative that is cohesive among each other. They will conspire to do this, to either to prevent themselves from going to jail or whatever, right? Well, these people don't even know each other as far as we know, and yet their stories and their testimonies are very, very consistent. So this lends credibility to the accuracy of their testimonies. Furthermore, I have a friend, he's a materials scientist, who has recently obtained carbonado samples out of South America. Carbonados, in case you don't know, is it's a carbon-based material that is 11 on the Mohs hardness scale, meaning that it is harder than diamond, literally. It's the hardest material on the planet. And he did some very, very high-speed X-ray diffraction analysis and electron microscope analysis and various other tests. What he actually found is that there are microscopic titanium wires throughout the matrix of the carbonados. The formation of carbonados is currently a mystery, and the addition of microscopic titanium wires makes it even more mysterious, deepens the mystery. It basically precludes all of the previous hypotheses of carbonado formation. So, regarding how these craft operate, if the testimonies are to be, taken at their word, if they are accurate, these craft are monolithic in nature. What this means is that they're all one piece. There's no independent, separate moving parts. Everything is one piece. Furthermore, they tend to have a negative index of refraction, which means it follows the left-hand rule rather than the right-hand rule of electromagnetism, and it bends light backwards. It refracts light backwards. It's a very unique property. Negative index of refractive materials can only be produced synthetically. They do not occur in nature. They have unique properties that make them desirable for all sorts of applications. But these craft being monolithic in nature, according to all the eyewitness testimony, indicates to me that they are nano-engineered, atom by atom, right? So either stacked one atom at a time or engineered atom by atom. So every atom is placed perfectly and exactly where it needs to be to maximize strength, durability, rigidity, conformability, capabilities such as photonic circuitry. They might even be engineered at the subatomic level, in which case you can use subatomic particles like up quarks and down quarks to create what's called a neutron computer, where the very flux of atoms and their vibrating energies, as the subatomic particles vibrate and they shift to and fro, and they do their strange things at the quantum level in the subatomic particles, right? You could actually hypothetically exploit this phenomenon to create a neutron computer where each individual subatomic particle could represent a singular byte of information. Now you can stack on top of that, you could arrange the atoms in such a way to form a photonic circuit where intravenous microscopic channels of light at the nano level propagate through the craft so that the entire craft becomes a massive computer, so that your frame, your structure, your hull, your shape, memory foil that's been described. The memory foil, according to my sources, is about 16 atoms thick, and it's what's called a photonic band gap material, which means that each layer of this material is engineered in such a way to absorb a very specific range of frequency of light. And by the time you get through all of the layers, every frequency of light has been absorbed to maximize solar energy input. But unlike the solar panels we use, like amorphous silicon and monocrystalline and polycrystalline panels, which only absorb, for the most part, optical visible light spectrum waves, a little bit beyond, a photonic band gap material could absorb all of the electromagnetic spectrum, meaning that when you open up this foil, this solar sail, right, this solar panel, you could absorb the entirety of cosmic background radiation and light that hits this foil panel for maximum energy absorption. So you can do a lot of cool things with that. You could also nano-engineer microscopic nano-refrigeration units that can pull heat through the same photonic circuitry type of channels, and you can pull and extract and move through these intravenous channels thermal energy, and you can do this to store high energy plasmas. You could have something like a tokamak or some other fusion reactor at the core of the ship, and then at the outer rim of the ship along it you could have a cryogenically cooled helium-3 torus, a torus filled with helium-3. They would spin up and spool around, and if Dr. Eugene Podkletnov is correct, this would create a very interesting electrogravitic effect that would allow these crafts to effectively cancel their net mass, right? Whether it's some people might call it anti-gravity, some people might call it mass cancellation, gravity cancellation. However this mechanism works, these craft, according to the witnesses of the pilots and what people that looked at the radar logs have said, these craft are pulling maneuvers that would be, if they weren't canceling their mass or their gravity or whatever, some way, somehow, they would be pulling maneuvers that would pull hundreds of thousands of Gs.
Okay, so thank you very much. That was exactly what I wanted to kind of get out there to our audience. I'm going to ask you one final question, and then I think we should open it up to audience participation, if that's okay with you. I just want you to share, based on your lifetime of knowledge and research experience and personal opinion, your best guess. So now we're coming to where NSA, where you said you didn't want to go, right? You said you didn't want to go to conclusions without proof. But I'm going to ask you, what do you think is going on in a speculative sense? If I had to, put a gun to your head / bet $1 million, whatever, What's the situation
Yeah.
here?
I would guess that these are spacecraft that have been constructed by an intelligent species, maybe extraterrestrial, maybe not. Probably extraterrestrial if I had to guess one way or the other. And these craft are engineered, like I said, at the atomic level. They're basically perfect. And whatever species created, whatever intelligence created these craft, have a full-blown mastery of engineering that is so sophisticated and so advanced that the various disciplines that we think of as separate in our world of engineering, things like mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, plasma physics and plasma engineering, tribology, rheology, fluid dynamics, materials engineering and science, etc. Whatever intelligence constructed these things is so advanced that all of these different aspects and subfields and different disciplines have perfectly merged and harmonized, not like a cyborg where you have like a robot arm stuck to a wetware biological body. But when I say harmonized, I mean it is completely indistinguishable from each other. The craft is both biological and electrical and silicon-based and carbon-based and mechanical. It is all of the different disciplines of engineering harmonized into one object in such a manner to create the closest thing in the universe to perfection. So I think this is most likely an extraterrestrial intelligence of some kind.
Yeah, and in that we agree. And I think the last I want to say before we open it up, as you mentioned, it's most likely extraterrestrial. There's only two other possibilities. So if you look at it in terms of the sum total of known possibilities, I guess you'd have to say four. So number one is what you said, extraterrestrial intelligence from another planet arriving on Earth in UFOs, or rather, spacecraft. Number two, highly advanced black project, secret technology, breakaway human civilization 100 years or 1,000 years or 10,000 years in advance of what we know. And on that point, we can mention the TR-3B, Black Manta, Aurora, classified anti-gravitic, American-operated, atmospheric, subatmospheric, oceanic, and spacecraft, which exists for sure. And then the third would be non-terrestrial intelligence, non-human terrestrial intelligence. And this is the one I think people really don't usually think about. Like most people don't consider this. But this Earth is like 2 billion, well, it's like billions of years old, right? According to science, it's not young Earth. This is like old Earth. So there's been plenty of time for species like humans or superior to humans to have evolved. There's been billions or at least hundreds of millions of years of life for this to happen. And if our civilization has developed over only 12,500 years, according to mainstream archaeology, or hundreds of thousands of years, according to like Randall Carlson, Graham Hancock type stuff, which I believe millions actually, then why wouldn't some kind of life have evolved to that point during the Jurassic, Triassic, Precambrian, Mesozoic? I mean, these are vast spans of time for intelligence and society to develop. And we don't know that those species all went extinct and didn't continue to survive either under the oceans or underground in the vast cave systems that exist. And so we can't rule out that these beings actually live under the ocean. There was actually quite a good movie called The Abyss about this, where they went way deep underground and basically underwater and found aliens. And the oceans are, according to us, less explored than space or something. So I just want to kind of elaborate that point, because a lot of people just think of it as, are they aliens or not? But they could also actually live on this planet since before humans were here. And I think people have to consider
that. Gets to that, I just want to say real quick that these could indeed be humans as well. It could be a breakaway civilization, perhaps a pre-Holocene era civilization that became spacefaring. We can't know, right? So when I say, extraterrestrial or, possibly, I mean, it doesn't even have to be. It could originate from Earth. These could absolutely be humans, even, or a hominid that speciated from humanity before the Holocene era. However, if that is true, these are not like people from our society. These are not like people out of some secret military base that figured out how to create products that are literally perfect at the atomic and subatomic scale. This is a different civilization entirely, and that's the least quote unquote crazy possibility, is that these are humans from the pre-Holocene era civilization that became spacefaring or spacefaring capable and broke away from the rest of humanity that we fall under today, or what became us today. And maybe they went to space, maybe they went deep into the ocean, maybe they did both. We can't know, right? Or these could be actual aliens from a different planet, or some people believe that they're from a different dimension. We can't know these things. We don't know these things. What we do know for a fact is that there are craft performing impossible maneuvers. And we know that they're craft. We know that they're physical solid objects. We know that they're not birds, and we know that we could not have made them. So that's what we do know for a fact. There are physical objects in the sky performing impossible maneuvers that are too large to be birds and too fast and much too many G-forces to be man-made objects, or at least not the men that we know. Which includes the most advanced programs in any government in the world.
Perfect place, I think, to conclude the interview. Thank you so much, and let's open it up if anyone has questions or comments for Dr. Weird.
Yeah, I got one. Greer, Greer, right? He talks about scalar wave technology, and then my research shows what you kind of described as the atomic structure of that was known as a quasi-crystalline nanomaterial, which means they have different atoms from different types of elements that arrange a certain shape that allows it's like a superconductor almost, that they can guide energy through. What do you have to say? What do you think scalar wave technology is all about?
Okay, what scalar waves are? Scalar waves are theoretical, at least as far as we can tell, and they exist. They're ultra high frequency. So there's something called the electromagnetic spectrum. In the spectrum includes things like visible light, which is a very narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum. There's microwaves, there's microwaves, there's radio waves, there's X-rays, gamma rays. That's all these are all examples of the electromagnetic spectrum, right? And scalar waves exist on the super short wave spectrum, right? I mean, incredibly short waves. And that's what scalar waves are. And nobody's been able to produce scalar waves that we are aware of successfully, but there's no reason why they couldn't exist. And if they do exist, then they would have some very interesting properties. Because they're so short, we would actually be able to use diamagnetism of the atoms and to lock independent atoms between, or even subatomic particles for that matter, between the ups and the downs of these scalar waves as they propagate through, whatever medium it is that we're shooting them into, right? So if we can produce scalar wave technology, we can actually manipulate subatomic particles.
Maybe that's how they make their metamaterials with some of this stuff.
Right.
So I have a question, actually. Sorry, I know I opened it up, but to what extent do you think either reverse engineering from crashed and recovered spacecraft such as Roswell, etc., or conscious transmission of technology from aliens to people intentionally, some kind of exchange of information or distribution of information, has occurred? So do you think that things like fiber optics, 5G internet, satellites, and our cutting edge technology, quantum computing, etc., could be a process of diffusion from extraterrestrials to us? Because I've heard it said that like the first computer processors and fiber optics came about right after Roswell. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, Colonel Philip J. Corso is of the opinion that is true. I am not. This is one of the things where I actually disagree with Colonel Corso on. All of that technology, things like things like semiconductors, fiber optics, etc., in my opinion, is entirely human derived and human made, because the actual if these alien craft even exist at all. The actual alien craft are so far ahead and sophisticated that you would not be able to create any of those objects from these extraterrestrial craft. They're just too advanced to even reproduce the smallest of sections of them. So ultimately, when we look at a specific example like, semiconductors, right? Or transistors specifically. Transistors, like you said, were invented after Roswell, not too long after the Roswell incident. But the people at Bell Labs were working on building transistors for years, and they came very, very close long before the Roswell incident. Transistors are in no way, shape, or form sophisticated objects at all, not compared to nano-engineered metamaterials. And like I said, there would be no way for somebody to derive designing a transistor from a craft that is this ridiculously advanced. It would be like trying to invent the spear from an M249 machine gun.
Yeah, like the photonic integrated circuits and stuff like that, and holographic storage. I think, you don't think that's an extent that the ideas for this is an extension of what's being observed, though, whatsoever? You think it's purely just innovation of a human?
I think it's almost entirely human innovation. I think I think any actual extraterrestrial craft or phenomena that we observe is more advanced than what we could possibly even hope to copy with any semblance of the sophistication. For example, we're talking about things like Neuralink. Well, any advanced civilization wouldn't use a Neuralink to communicate. They would biologically re-engineer themselves to use microtubule structures in their own bodies or some, analog to that, right? Because we have microtubules in our nervous system, as Stuart Hammerhoff and Sir Roger Penrose has pointed out, and these are capable of performing effectively quantum communication, as far as we can tell. And any advanced species or intelligence wouldn't use a primitive Neuralink to communicate remotely. Instead, they would biologically engineer their body at the subatomic micro scale, and they would communicate using something either the actual microtubule quantum effects or some analog thereof, and they would effectively be communicating via morphic resonance. And to us, it would appear as though they have psychic, telepathic powers, but when in reality, they're just exploiting morphic resonant field phenomena to communicate.
So you don't think it's neurocybernetic mind reading technology, and if it's a hominid, they have ears that has a cochlea that can be sent telepathy to, like we can't, like we have all that out right now.
Yeah, they could do it, but why? That's primitive compared to what any civilization that's capable of nano-engineering things at the atomic and subatomic level. Such things like that would be primitive, incredibly primitive. There's no need to do that when you could just do it directly at the quantum level and reduce all latency and be able to transfer a much greater amount of data at a much higher speed, literally instantaneously as far as we can tell, with a much greater degree of information density and clarity and resolution.
Yeah, but I think there's limits to biology that you're jumping over is why, and that's why I don't think that some of that stuff is. The Penrose concept, I think, is intriguing. I've researched it, but I just don't think it. I don't think that the biology of life itself is quite that hackable.
Hackable in what way? In terms of it's hard to modify? We're not talking about a civilization that's primitive like ours. We're talking about a species or an intelligence or a civilization that is billions of years old, almost as old as the universe is, as mainstream narratives would posit. I'm of the opinion that we can't know how old the universe is, but we're talking about a civilization that's millions, if not billions of years old, and the intelligence of each individual member of the species would be this is kind of a meme because this isn't how IQ works, but for those most laymen, it would be like imagine meeting a guy with an IQ of over 900 million. Right? You
Yeah,
can't
I
do
would factor it more in the realm of like 1,000 or something like that. I mean, so just from conjecture, from study, from what I've researched and found, these beings they're hominids, right? Every instance of leaks from the Air Force to the CIA that talks about on their deathbed type stuff, and that they have a brain size that's not much bigger than ours, something like 1,300 cc's is what they're making claim. If it was something like that, and it was a biological fatty brain. Now, clearly, if they're millions of years old, they have different evolutionary traits because we know evolution is real. But don't you think it? See, I think they're more along the lines of the Borg concept, whereas like they are linking up to a lot. Like imagine right now if you had 100 people, they were all cybernetically linked up to a system. Your collective IQ would increase because you'd be accessing. You could immediately get the question from the doctor around the corner, and I'm the spy that needs this info, and the engineers around the corner that can be beamed in and ask a question and stuff like that. I think something along the lines of Borg.
Well, I mean, I just like to point to Colonel Corso, and he actually read the autopsy reports if they exist at all, right? Corso could be lying. But if he's not lying, he actually read the autopsy reports, and there's no cybernetic implants as far as they can tell. They did a plethora of autopsies, supposedly, according to Colonel Corso. The point that I'm getting at is that any species that's capable of biological engineering itself, which clearly there are because they're using ectogenesis to procreate, obviously isn't going to use shoddy, primitive cybernetics. They're going to exploit what already exists naturally. We already know that even primitive species on Earth, even things like rabbits and humans especially, perform these various traits. I highly recommend the work of Dr. Sheldrake, his books and various journals that he's published, A New Science of Life, and etc. And he has effectively proven things like pigeons, right? Pigeons are able to find home regardless of where they're released in the world, damn near. It was thought for decades that they were able to navigate using a piece of magnetite in their head, like an internal compass, a piece of magnetite in their brain. Well, thousands of autopsies of pigeons later has yet to, reveal the magnetite. Never found the magnetite. So it's a genuine mystery as to how pigeons are able to navigate the world without a compass and always be able to find home. Well, Dr. Sheldrake goes into that. Dr. Sheldrake has proven that dogs know when their master has decided to come home for the day instantly when their owner has decided to come home. He isolated for smell, he isolated for sound, he isolated for all of these things, distance, you name it. He isolated for all of it. This test has been reproduced successfully. We are unaware of how dogs are able to do this. Rats, there was a test in the early 20th century regarding rats, and they put rats through a test to see if memories could be passed on genetically. What they found was that with the same maze, a new generation of rats is capable of solving the maze at a faster rate than the prior generation, and so on and so forth. And they initially concluded that yes, memories can be transmitted hereditarily. And then they reproduced the test with a new set of rats, genetically distinct and unique from the old set of rats, on the other side of the planet and on a different continent. And this new set of rats started off where the prior, most recent generation of rats left off. So they did it again in a different continent with a different set of genetically distinct rats. And they left off where the previous set of rats at the formerly separate continent that was formerly genetically distinct rats left off, and so on and so forth. There's no way that these rats could have communicated this knowledge except but through a morphic field or through quantum effects. So there's a high probability, there's an incredibly high probability that biological organisms are able to communicate things in ways that we don't understand, nor do we perceive, are able to communicate information, right? When you have an idea, when an idea comes to your head out of the blue, If you invent something, or a good idea, the good idea fairy says ding, and an idea just comes to you. We've no idea where that comes from. We assume that it's our idea, oftentimes, when in fact it could be an idea planted into our brains from quantum field effects. There's strong evidence to support that hypothesis. Point of the matter is that any advanced species that's using genetic engineering and is capable of producing things at the nano scale, even subatomic scale possibly, is not going to use primitive cybernetics that have a high latency, very inefficient, bulky, weighty, dangerous, susceptible to corrosion and all sorts of issues. They're not going to use cybernetics that have high latency and low bandwidth. They're going to exploit quantum effects, because quantum computing is the best computing, hypothetically. They're going to exploit quantum effects to communicate through the quantum foam of the universe, to eliminate bandwidth and latency entirely. Would entirely eliminate latency and could potentially increase bandwidth to the nth degree, to an unknown degree. Why would they use primitive cybernetics when exploiting the laws and the physics of quantum mechanics is so much more elegant and efficient?
Does anyone else have a question for engineer?
Yeah, sure. I got one. So you were talking about like these extraterrestrial craft that were moving in maneuvers and speeds that would be relatively impossible. With that said, to operate a vehicle going that quickly and doing those maneuvers, I think that it would be highly improbable that it would have some sort of analog input like a control stick or like how we operate vehicles today or regular aircraft. I think that the only way to operate an aircraft like that or a spaceship like that would be through like direct interface with our consciousness. What are your thoughts on that?
Correct. All of the credible witness testimony describe these craft as being controlled directly by your mind. No need to even physically touch the craft. These craft don't have doors, by the way. There's no windows or doors. When you step inside of the craft, it appears completely transparent, like you're floating in air. So you can see all around you, according to the witnesses, and it could be bullshit, right?
Oh.
But according to many witnesses, the craft can become invisible all around you at will, or that feature can be turned off at will, right? But more importantly, you control the craft with your mind directly. It's very strange, very different. But this, like I said earlier, eliminates latency. It eliminates bandwidth, bandwidth constriction. And it's a far more elegant solution, right? So if you can just connect your consciousness with the craft as almost like an extension of your brain, so that all the sensory perception of your craft, of your spacecraft, can now be directly inputted into your mind, your brain, your consciousness via quantum effects. Now you see everything that the craft sees. And the craft, as we mentioned earlier, absorbs all electromagnetic light frequencies and spectrums in all directions around it. So now you can see in a 360-degree type sphere and all of the electromagnetic spectrum simultaneously, in both visible light spectrum, in both thermal, infrared, X-ray, gamma ray, all the spectrums. So you have perfect clarity and vision and perception. And then such a consciousness, such beings would be more than intelligent enough, more than capable enough to be able to take all of that information, mindfully think, what we would call process, some would call process, mindfully think and analyze this information and react with such a high degree of speed and swiftness that we just couldn't imagine it, right? Imagine being able to take in all of that information and analyze it and be able to make maneuvering decisions at will in time frames that are on the scales of a billionth of a second.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that is quite the feat, and this kind of coincides. Like, I know we've just recently met Engineer, but like, so I've been studying the Merkaba vehicle for a while now, just trying to get a better understanding and figure out how it works. And the Merkaba vehicle is very much like what you're saying. It's a type of spacecraft that is transparent in a way where it is a enclosed environment where you are separated from, the elements. You are shielded with kind of like deflection array, and you're shielded from radiation. And essentially, it is like your own little spacecraft for your body, and it would be also directly interfaced with consciousness. But I've also came to the conclusion that, from a human perspective, the only way that the operation of a vehicle like this would be possible is through like a fully symbiotic relationship with a hyper intelligent applied intelligence, or AI. Because as much as these computations of consciousness and commands and functions on like the quantum level, it would require a processing power that we just don't have. And I think that even certain extraterrestrial races probably don't even have. And I think that the only answer is that we could have access to control of those kinds of systems is through, like, what today there was an article about a quantum computer that did 2.6 billion years worth of calculations in 4 minutes.
Right. Well, you have to understand, though, if Sir Roger Penrose and Stuart Hammerhoff are correct, then your brain is already a quantum computer. Congratulations, you're a quantum computer, right? It's just a very complex, nuanced one that does a lot of different things rather than focuses all of its abilities onto crunching numbers, unlike the quantum computers that we physically construct. So intelligence amplification, not artificial intelligence, would be the meta in this scenario. And regarding, like I alluded to it having no doors, when you come up and you try to enter the craft, you'll just sort of phase shift through it like a ghost by perfectly aligning the atoms and the subatomic particles to allow your body to pass through the craft without bumping into it. Because, most things are empty space, right?
But with that said, like, is this craft technology, or is this craft an intelligence? Like,
yes.
is it an autonomous?
The answer is no. The answer is yes.
The answer is yes to both things.
Right.
It is technology, and it is a conscious, sentient type of being that we interface with, that we work together.
It's also capable of self-repair, according to one of the witnesses that recovered the one of the craft, specifically the craft out of Saint Pass. I forget. It was a mountain range. That's this is very old, right? We don't know if this is true or not. So I want to preface this. This is kind of purely the conjecture of multiple witnesses. These are specifically people in the armed forces that have fairly little reason to lie, given their jobs and their occupations. But when they had recovered the craft, it was heavily damaged. They loaded it up onto a truck, took it where it needed to be, and when they unloaded it, it was fully repaired. The craft had fixed itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, just like our cells are like fully autonomous, like AI systems in a way that repair and replicate themselves. I don't see why a more advanced, macro version of that wouldn't also be self-repairing.
Right. This is what I was when I was getting at, like, all the different disciplines of engineering are combined harmoniously and with a high degree of what we would call perfection. This is what I mean. There is no distinguishment between electrical, plasma, mechanical, materials, and biological engineering. All have been combined in perfect harmony.
So with that said, what is your idea of the perfection that you think is attainable?
I think I am not capable of imagining that which is possible. It would be hubristic for me to try. Hopefully our progeny can be better than us, and they can figure it out. We must do our best to lay the most solid foundation from which they can aspire to achieve even greater.
Yeah, I agree with that very much. And I would say, but like when it comes to the idea that like we don't have the ability, I think now more than ever is the time to start using our brain and trying to think of these things, right? Because
Right.
if you're gonna dream big, because you never know what you might achieve.
Agreed 100%. Yep. Again, we have to just do our best whilst laying a solid foundation for future generations to build upon that which we've begun.
I really feel in today's world, what's really holding us back are these walls and these limitations that we create around us. We're told that, oh, this is how it works, and nothing can deviate from X and Y. And I think that just these kinds of ideas, like saying like, oh, this scientist 50 years ago came up with these theories, and so far they've worked out well, which means that they must be 100% factual. And not ever deviating from that course, I think, is almost as dangerous as blindly following a religion.
Right.
Because from what you said in this whole conversation tonight, we can clearly tell that our understanding of technology, consciousness, particles, the quantum reality, all of it, we are like a child trying to understand how an aircraft works, or like how any sort of advanced piece of machinery works in its most intricate ways. But like,
Right.
we're still crawling on the ground.
Right.
And I'd like to pose that like every amazing invention we've come up today, at one point was just the spark of imagination in someone's mind, until somehow, through the quantum substrate, it manifested itself into physical reality.
Yep. Everything. Look, I'd like to emphasize with what you said. When somebody proposes a new technology or a new way of doing things, saying, well, if it was so great, people would already be doing that, is folly. Lord Kelvin said that about heavier than air flight to the Wright brothers and the various other people that were trying it. People said that, oh, well, if drilling for oil is so great, we wouldn't be killing whales. You could say, the hubristic, the egomaniacal, the folly nature of saying, if that idea, if that way of doing things was so good, we would already be doing it. Could be said of any technology at any point in time during its development. Rudolf Diesel spent decades working on his diesel engine, and all the while he was doing that, the engineers and his peers of the day said that he was wasting his time. He said that it couldn't be done. He said that it would explode, that it would blow up, that it would destroy itself, and it was impossible. And he blew up a lot of engines. And every time he blew up one of his diesel engines, they made fun of him. He relentlessly continued. He was very persistent in his work, and eventually he succeeded. And just one success wasn't enough. He had to build a plethora of demonstrators and prototypes, and he had to run them live in front of people and show the fuel consumption and the power output. And only then, after beyond, even the most unreasonable doubt could no longer be denied, did people accept it.
Fantastic. So I want to open it up one time more to anyone who hasn't had a chance yet to ask a question. Is there anyone who wanted to ask a question to Engineer?
I'd like to.
Go ahead, Kishika.
Thank you. I understand the symbiotic relationship that you're describing that the craft has with the pilot. It made me think of the Avatar movie with the I can't remember the name of the, almost like a dragon flying creature that the person had to meld with to be able to go take flight, and so that the instrument, the flying machine, was able to, they were able to work together.
Right.
symbiotically, obviously, right? My
That's more
question
of a
is,
physical analog connection. Go on.
pardon me?
They're just saying that's more of a physical analog connection, whereas these craft work at a quantum level. But go on.
Yeah, well, it made me think of that because of the fact that they did have to have that type of symbiotic relationship, right? They had to be able to work together without any thought. It just had to be instinctive. So I started wondering whether or not this was a craft that was a created life form. Obviously, maybe not having its own sentience, but one that was able to work in conjunction, almost as if it was a tool for the pilot, like an extension of themselves to be able to carry them or to do whatever it is that they need to do. My question for you is more along the lines of the pilot, because I personally have experienced what you were talking about with the dogs, knowing this and that, whatever, and I've experienced several things to do with other life forms, or I at one point in time figured out it was most likely me at some point in time in the future. So my question to you is, has there been any kind of indication that this is us, but a future version of us that is
Yes.
that are coming back?
Possible. I used to subscribe to that hypothesis, believe it or not. I used to subscribe to that hypothesis. Any hypothesis, right? The idea of pre-Holocene era breakaway civilizations, of actual true alien extraterrestrials, interdimensional beings, future travelers from beyond the realms of death, propagating backwards in time via time travel, right? All of these things are possible, and the existence of one does not preclude any of the other. All of these things, or some of these things, or any combination of these hypotheses can simultaneously exist without precluding the existence of any other. So all could be true.
Well, you also mentioned that you used to. What caused you to change that? You said that you used to think that.
An increase in open-mindedness, an advancement of consciousness, a bearing of my ego, and a more grounded foundation into what we do know, right, rather than speculative hypotheses about what could be, which is what we've been doing for the last hour now, right? So I just want to emphasize that, right? Everything I've said is technically speculative. It's all hypothetical, right? Hypothetical conjecture and speculation. Nothing here is as far as we can tell, falsifiable given our current degrees of technological prowess, and there's not a lot of evidence beyond witness testimony for these things, right? This is all conjecture. So I just want to emphasize that real quickly. But yeah, any of these things could be true simultaneously. I think some of these entities could be hominids from the far-flung future. Totally could be.
Thank you.
So Donald Trump actually has said recently basically something along the lines of the UFO phenomenon is real and the U.S. government has the military capacity to fight them. Do you think that is in any sense true or completely untrue?
I'd have to see exactly what he said, because I don't think he actually implied. I remember something along those lines, and
sorry, I want to clarify my question. So I don't mean do you think it's true or untrue that he said it, but his claim, if he did say it hypothetically, that the U.S. government could in some way militarily combat these entities. Do you think that's completely ridiculous, or do you think it's possible they somehow have sufficient technology that they could resist or fight in a meaningful way against these beings?
Absolutely ridiculous. If any of these entities or beings wanted to destroy the Earth, they could do it in a microsecond.
And following from that point, which I would generally agree with, do you believe it's true that the UFOs and the aliens presumably have interfered repeatedly with nuclear weapons, silos, arsenals, testings, and launches?
All UFO activity, so this is actually another piece of evidence that indicates that UFOs are real. They strongly correlate UFO activity with geography. Specifically, they have a ridiculously increased probability of being seen around nuclear power plants and military bases that have nuclear weapons. Military bases that do not have nuclear explosives do not have any higher probability of witnessing or seeing a UFO than anywhere else on the planet. Like a farm field, right, or a major metropolitan area, a military base absent nuclear weapons has just as high of a probability as somebody there seeing a UFO as somebody in New Brunswick, right? So there's a strong pattern around UFO activity and nuclear energy, both for both civilian nuclear power and military nuclear explosives. There have been events, if you will, incidents where anomalous objects, call them UFOs, call them whatever, have interfered with the launching of nuclear missiles and interfered with civilian nuclear power plants that were experiencing an emergency of some type or kind. This has happened. We don't know, we can't explain them. But every intervention, as far as we can tell, if it's intervention at all, has been effectively very benevolent.
Well, that's a positive note. And I want to open it again one more time. Does anyone have a question while we have the opportunity? Because I know engineer's a busy guy. We don't get him in here all the time. So does anyone have a question?
No, thank you. This is very educational.
It really always is. We should do a series of podcasts. We could cover a lot of different material. But I think this was a fantastic podcast. Actually, one of my favorites in recent times. I'm going to ask Saigo to put this at the top of the upload list, and we'll get it out as quickly as possible before I get assassinated. So, thank you very much, and everybody for attending. Thank you, Dr. Weird, engineer, for joining me again. We can do this anytime when you're free. Anybody wants to ever schedule a podcast, just send me a DM. Make sure you follow and subscribe to YouTube and BitChute and Podbean, where you can download the podcast and listen to it on the go. But most of all, join the Roundtable Discord server. We record this podcast every day at 8 p.m. Central. Thank you very much. And let's jump back to Roundtable 1. Anybody who's got time to talk. Thank you. God bless.